Before we start the video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell so you can receive all our latest updates. The series begins in Moscow in 1988, and there is someone named Valery who is currently recording tapes in which he recounts the true events of the Chernobyl nuclear reactor explosion. And as we know, Valery is a physicist who witnessed the Chernobyl explosion, and because of that, he is recording these tapes. When Valery finishes telling the tragic story of Chernobyl, he takes the tapes he recorded and hides them away somewhere. Afterwards, Valery returns home and smokes his last cigarette in life before taking his own life. Now we go back in time to the year 1986 in the city of Pripyat in Ukraine, which was part of the Soviet Union at that time, to witness the events of the Chernobyl reactor explosion, so we can understand what led Valery to suicide. Currently, there is a girl named Lucia who lives in a place close to the Chernobyl reactor, and when Lucia is standing, suddenly there is an explosion in the reactor, and it was so strong that the whole building shakes. Because of what happened, her husband Vasily wakes up, and they both watch the explosion, not understanding anything. So we will go for the reactor itself to understand what happened. The chief engineer at the reactor, named Dyatlov, stood with his team of workers. An explosion occurs, and no one understands what has happened. However, Dyatlov suspects that the incident was a hydrogen tank explosion. Even before Dyatlov resolves the issue, he claims that the problem arose because of his assistants, Leonid and Sasha, so that no one can hold him accountable. Dyatlov orders his assistants Sasha and Leonid to turn on the water pumps in the reactor core to prevent an explosion. At that moment, one of the workers named Valera came. Valera told everyone that the reactor itself has exploded, which is obviously a massive disaster due to the radiation, and that's why Dyatlov literally refuses to believe it, and everyone knows that nothing happened. Dyatlov orders Valera to go and operate the water pumps and asks another worker to call the firefighters to come and extinguish the hydrogen tank fire. He leaves everyone and heads off. Before Valera goes to start the pumps, he approaches another worker at the reactor and takes a radiation measuring device from him to assess the radiation levels in the area. He finds it to be 3.6 μcuries vol. However, the problem is that this device is old, and its last reading was also 3.6 μcuries vol, while the new device that could accurately measure the actual radiation levels in the storage is locked up. This drives Valera crazy, but he doesn't dwell on it and continues on to start the pumps. While he is going to the pumps, Valera meets another worker and asks him who is responsible for the pumps. But as Valera is talking, he becomes extremely fatigued from the radiation and starts to vomit blood. The other worker decides to complete the task and heads to the pumps, only to find the whole area completely destroyed and see a worker there whose face is literally melting due to the radiation. So he carried the worker to save him, but on his way, he meets two other workers who were supposed to be sent by Dyatlov to operate the pumps as well. This worker decides to help them and takes them to the reactor room, opening the door for them to enter and see the place. They find it completely destroyed, which frightens them, and they leave. The worker who helped them starts bleeding from all over his body due to the radiation. One of the two workers returns to Dyatlov, and he is very ill from the radiation, informing him that the reactor is completely destroyed, and he starts vomiting blood as well. Despite all this, Dyatlov refuses to believe that the reactor has been destroyed, insisting that what happened was just an explosion in the hydrogen storage, nothing more. So Dyatlov orders his assistant Sasha to contact all the morning shift workers to come and help them. Sasha agrees and begins calling everyone. After a while, Sasha and Leonid are joined by a worker named Boris. Boris tells them that he went to operate the pumps and found all the workers dead and the place completely destroyed, and they need to sort the place out before they all die. But since Sasha and Leonid know that this won't happen, they leave Boris and go to manually operate the water pumps. Although they are starting to feel fatigued due to the radiation, they continue to try to operate the pumps, all to avoid being reprimanded by Dyatlov. Speaking of Dyatlov, he is gathering with Fomin, the chief engineer, and Dyatlov's direct supervisor, also Bryukhanov, the plant manager. Dyatlov informs them that he was conducting a safety test, and unfortunately, the hydrogen storage exploded. Everyone sees that the situation is simple, but they still decide to convene the board of directors and all the important officials in the city to figure out what to do. Indeed, after a while, the members of the board and the important officials arrive, and at the forefront is the Deputy Secretary General of the Communist Party in the city. And what you could say is that the city is under the control of the authorities. At that time, Bryukhanov, Fomin, and Dyatlov start telling everyone what happened. Everyone is convinced that only the hydrogen storage exploded, but one of those present informs everyone that the reactor might have exploded. The best thing is for them to evacuate the factory in the city, but no one believes him, and even the Deputy Secretary General silences him. Everyone thinks the problem is minor and will be resolved quickly. The most important thing is to keep the matter secret. Therefore, they must seal off the city with no one allowed to enter or leave. So, the deputy and everyone present leave after they've literally wrecked the place. At the same time, the morning shift workers arrive at the factory, and among these workers is engineer Sitnikov. One of the workers approaches Sitnikov and informs him that they need the advanced radiation measuring device that's in his locker. Sitnikov agrees and decides to go measure the radiation. After a while, Sitnikov goes to Fomin, Dyatlov, and Bryukhanov and informs them that he measured the radiation, and it turned out to be a full 200 degrees. Also, the reactor itself has been completely destroyed, and they have to evacuate the entire city. Despite what Sitnikov said, the three of them do not agree with him because they don't want to take on the responsibility. So, Dyatlov prefers to shout at Sitnikov, and he falls down due to his extreme fatigue from the radiation. Then, one of the soldiers comes and takes him to the hospital, but Fomin and Bryukhanov ordered Sitnikov to go to the reactor center to make sure it had exploded or not. Sitnikov is afraid because he might die, but they give him orders so he cannot disobey them, so he goes to check the center. When he returns to them again, he is irradiated, and of course, Fomin and Bryukhanov go crazy because they finally confirm that the reactor has actually exploded. They don't know what to do. As for Dyatlov, he goes to the hospital, and we see that the hospital is filled with people due to many being exposed to radiation. On the other hand, we see Vasily, Lucia's husband, if you remember, arriving with the firefighters at the factory, and they keep trying to extinguish the fire, but it just won't go out. Additionally, one of Vasily's friends gets injured on his hand because he picked up a piece of graphite that is found in the reactor's core. As a result, his hand keeps burning for no reason, which frightens everyone, but they still keep trying to put out the fire, albeit without any success. So, since everyone finally convinced that there is indeed a crisis, we transition to Valery, whom we saw at the very beginning of the series. Valery is at home when he receives a call from Minister Sherbina, the Minister of Energy and Oil. Sherbina informs Valery of everything that has happened and asks him to come to a meeting tomorrow at the office of the General Secretary of the Communist Party to discuss what to do about the reactor. Valery agrees, and they make arrangements. The next day, at the Nuclear Energy Agency in Belarus under the Soviet Union, and the expert physicist Anla is currently using a device that reads strange radiation results, which leads her to start making calls. She discovers that this radiation is coming from a massive explosion that occurred at the Chernobyl reactor in Ukraine. Anla becomes worried and immediately approaches the Deputy Secretary of the Communist Party in her city and informs him that there is dangerous radiation heading toward the city, and they need to distribute iodine pills to protect everyone from the radiation. However, this deputy is literally ignorant and dismisses Anla's concerns. Frustrated, she leaves him and returns to her agency, where she thinks for a while before deciding to travel to the Chernobyl reactor to see if she can help. At the same time, the scientist Valery arriving at the office of the General Secretary to attend a meeting with Minister Sherbina. While Valery is waiting to enter the meeting, a staff member brings him a file regarding the Chernobyl incident. As Valery reads the file, he becomes terrified by what he sees. After a short while, Valery enters the meeting with Minister Sherbina, the General Secretary, and other leaders. Sherbina starts talking to the General Secretary, trying to downplay the Chernobyl incident, claiming it is a simple matter that will be resolved quickly and poses no danger. Of course, this is completely incorrect, and Valery gets angry, making everyone realize that what happened at Chernobyl is literally a catastrophe. The radiation that Valery has read about in the file has the potential to kill all the residents of the city, and even all of Ukraine. Moreover, the reactor fire could burn for over a month, and the radiation levels will continue to rise. They need to stop all of this as quickly as possible before the catastrophe worsens. At that moment, the general secretary becomes worried and orders Sherbina to take Valery with him to the reactor to take action. Sherbina, though irritated, agrees and takes Valery in his helicopter as they head to the Chernobyl reactor. After a while, they actually arrive at the city where the reactor is located, where they meet Fomin, Bryukhanov, and General Bikalov, the military governor of the city. In that moment, Sherbina starts scolding Fomin and Bryukhanov about what they did, but the two continue to deny that any real problem occurred. They inform Sherbina that what happened was merely a minor explosion in the hydrogen storage, which means they should be able to control it. Valery becomes angry because this is not true at all and asks General Bikalov to measure the radiation levels so they can see who is actually telling the truth. Bikalov agrees and heads off in a special vehicle to measure the radiation. When he returns, he informs Valery and the others that the radiation level at the reactor is 15,000 microsieverts. At this point, Sherbina goes into a panic and immediately decides to refer Fomin and Bryukhanov for military trial. As Sherbina begins to trust Valery more, he asks him, "What should we do?" After Sherbina and the emergency committee decided to evacuate the city due to the critical situation, the evacuation plan was set in motion the following day. As the hours passed, the evacuation process was carried out systematically, but the city began to resemble a ghost town, with empty streets and an eerie silence as the life of its residents faded away. Meanwhile, the scientist Onla was on her way to the city. Upon her arrival, she requested the military officers who were sealing off the city to allow her to meet with Valery and Sherbina. She was quickly escorted to them. During the meeting between Onla, Valery, and Sherbina, Onla began to explain the tense situation beneath the reactor. She informed them that there were large tanks of water filled beneath the reactor, and that continuing to extinguish the flames with sand could lead to a disaster similar to volcanic lava. The heat from the fire could cause this water to boil suddenly, potentially resulting in a massive radiological explosion, which could kill millions of people around the world. Valery and Sherbina were horrified to hear this news. It felt as if a nightmare was unfolding before their eyes. The only hope of preventing this catastrophe was to take immediate action. Valery, who understood the severity of the situation, began to devise a plan to regain control. He explained that they needed to cool the water tanks in some way to avoid an explosion. He discussed the importance of reaching the water tank and finding ways to cool it safely, away from using sand that could exacerbate the situation. Sherbina, who had begun to feel the magnitude of the disaster that could result from party actions, felt a greater sense of responsibility. He emphasized the necessity of cooperation among all available teams to reach a quick solution before it was too late. From that moment on, various teams began to move quickly, allocating the necessary resources to manage the situation. The pressure was mounting, and time was running out. Everyone in the city witnessed a state of panic and tension, but hope began to seep into their hearts that they might be able to change the course of events. At that moment, Valery was shocked because he had no knowledge of the water tanks. Immediately, he, Onla, and Sherbina went to meet the General Secretary of the Communist Party to inform him about everything. They also explained that they needed 3 workers who were familiar with the reactor to dive into the tanks beneath the reactor and empty them completely. By doing this, they would be able to extinguish the reactor fire with sand as they planned. However, the only problem was that these workers would be getting very close to the reactor and the radiation source, which meant that they would likely die within a week after this mission. The General Secretary was stunned by this information, but ordered Valery to implement the plan, as it was the only solution available. Valery and Sherbina quickly gathered all the remaining reactor workers and spoke with them. Valery asked for 3 volunteers for the mission, but no one agreed. Then Sherbina spoke to them openly, telling them that whoever volunteered for this mission would face death, but some must sacrifice themselves for the sake of millions. Sherbina's words had an impact on the workers, and eventually, 3 of them agreed to volunteer for the mission. They started preparing the volunteers and dressing them in diving suits. Afterward, the 3 workers entered the tanks beneath the reactor to open them, and then let's temporarily leave them and turn our attention to Lucia. Lucia is heading to a hospital where her husband Vasily has been taken, along with all the firefighters who suffered from radiation while extinguishing the reactor fire. She approaches an officer and asks about Vasily. The officer informs her that Vasily will be transferred to Moscow for treatment. Lucia pleads with him to let her accompany him, and the officer agrees, letting her know that she can ride the plane taking Vasily to Moscow. Lucia is overjoyed and heads to the plane to board it with her husband. After a while, Lucia arriving in Moscow and heading to the hospital. She asks the receptionist about her husband. The receptionist informs her that he is indeed admitted there, but she cannot allow Lucia to see him right now due to the risk of transmitting any illness. In response, Lucia offers a bribe to the nurse, and she agrees to let her in. Lucia then goes to her husband's room, but before she can enter, another nurse stops her and refuses to let her in. Lucia considers giving her a bribe as well, but the nurse declines and mentions that Lucia can see her husband, but only for half an hour, and she is not allowed to touch him at all. The nurse then asks Lucia if she is pregnant, because if she is, she cannot go near her husband due to the risk of birth defects for the child. Despite being pregnant, Lucia lies to the nurse and is permitted to enter her husband Vasily's room. Although she isn't supposed to touch him, Lucia embraces him and holds him close. She stays with Vasily, but then Lucia suddenly hears him screaming. He was experiencing intense internal pain due to radiation exposure. Confused and distressed, Lucia sees doctors rush in to remove her from the room so they can treat Vasily. After a while, Vasily stabilizes, but it is clear that his burns have worsened significantly, and it looks like he is nearing death. Lucia decides to spend his remaining moments with him, cherishing every second they have left. On the other side, the workers who descended to open the tanks beneath the reactor coming out, feeling elated because they successfully completed their mission. Their success brings joy to Sherbina and Valery. However, their happiness doesn't last long, as they soon face a new problem. They communicate with the General Secretary of the Communist Party to inform him about the issue, which is that they have discovered that the temperature of the soil has risen significantly. This increase poses a serious risk of the reactor core melting entirely, leading to an explosion that would cause damage far worse than the initial reactor explosion. If the core melts, it could contaminate the river water, poisoning the water supply for more than 50 million people. The only solution is to drill beneath the core and install a device called a heat exchanger, which will require an enormous amount of liquid nitrogen. However, the cost for this operation is exceedingly high. This news does not please the General Secretary at all, but he eventually agrees to the plan. They now need miners skilled in drilling to work beneath the reactor core, aware that these workers will almost certainly suffer from radiation illnesses and likely die from them. Despite this, they decide to proceed because there is no other choice. After finishing the call with the General Secretary, Sherbina and Valery take a moment to walk. During their walk, Sherbina asks Valery whether they might become ill due to their work at the site. Valery informs him that they will certainly suffer from illnesses, potentially life-threatening ones like severe anemia or cancer. The silver lining, however, is that they might not develop these diseases for several years, since they aren't directly exposed to radiation. Feeling disheartened by this reality, Sherbina falls silent. Later, Valery approaches Omla and asks her to travel to the Moscow hospital to meet with Sasha, Leonid, and Dyatlov, who are receiving treatment there. He wants her to know from them what caused the reactor's destruction so they can avoid making the same mistakes with other reactors. Omla agrees and decides to carry out the task. The next day, the Minister of Coal in the Soviet Union visits the largest coal mine in the country, where he meets with Andrei, the chief miner. The minister addresses all the miners, informing them that he needs their assistance for a job in Chernobyl. All the miners readily agree, and they head out with him. After a while, they arrive at the site of the reactor. At that moment, Andrei sits with Sherbina and Valery, where Valery explains the type of work required and the specific area that needs to be excavated for the heat exchanger installation. He also outlines the dangers that he and his workers may face, including the risk of diseases and the danger of reactor core meltdown, which could lead to an explosion that wipes everyone out in an instant. Despite these warnings, Andrei agrees to the job, and he and his team begin executing the task. After a while, Sherbina approaches Valery, feeling pleased that Andrei and his workers are close to finishing their task. However, Valery does not share his happiness, knowing that there are other problems on the horizon, and he asks Sherbina to contact the General Secretary as soon as possible. Sherbina agrees, and they coordinate for that. On the other hand, Onella visits Dyatlov at the Moscow hospital, where she finds his health condition has significantly deteriorated due to his illness. Onella asks Dyatlov about the cause of the reactor explosion, but he feels desperate and refuses to tell her anything. She leaves him and moves on to Leonid, whose condition is even worse than Dyatlov's. Nevertheless, Leonid cooperates with Onella and tells her a very strange piece of information. The pressure in the reactor has risen dramatically, and there was supposed to be a button to press in such a situation to shut down the reactor. However, the surprise is that when they pressed that button, the reactor exploded. Wonla is shocked by this news, and when she goes to Sasha, he confirms what Leonid said, further raising her suspicions and making her feel that something is wrong. While Onella is wandering through the hospital, pondering all these details, she accidentally spots Lucia sitting near her husband Vasily, telling him that she is pregnant while holding his hand. Distressed, she goes up to Lucia, pulls her away, and calls over a nurse, arguing with her for allowing a pregnant woman to approach a patient. Onella tells the nurse that she will expose the hospital and reveal the negligence happening there. However, at this point, two individuals approach Onella, raising concerns and questions about what will happen next. The two individuals approaching Onella are from the Russian intelligence, as during this time in the Soviet Union, intelligence operatives were spread everywhere, monitoring everyone. Currently, due to Onella's comments about exposing the situation, they decide to detain her as she poses a danger to the state. Meanwhile, Sherbina and Valery are waiting to enter a meeting with the General Secretary. However, before they enter, Sherbina informs Valery that Onella has been arrested, which upsets Valery and prompts him to take action. After that, they enter the General Secretary's meeting, where all the leadership is present. Generally, Valery updates everyone that they have almost extinguished the reactor fire and are currently digging under the reactor core to install the heat exchanger, which is good news. The bad news, however, is that they need to evacuate a large number of people from nearby towns to prevent radiation exposure. Additionally, they will require many workers to literally cut down all the forests surrounding the reactor and dispose of nuclear waste in the surrounding towns. This way, they can ensure they have eliminated the radiation threat. However, such an operation will require hundreds of thousands of workers, and many of them are likely to die due to diseases from the nuclear waste. Despite the high costs involved, everyone agrees, as there is no other solution. The meeting concludes, and Valery approaches the head of intelligence, who was present during their meeting. Valery informs him that his friend has been unfairly arrested and he wants her released. The head of intelligence asks, "Will you vouch for her?" Valery confirms that he will, and the head decides to release her. At that moment, Valery is about to mention her name, but the head makes a joke and informs him that he already knows her name, then leaves, indicating that they are aware of everything. A few days later, Valery visits Onella in prison to release her. They sit down and talk, and Onella informs Valery about the safety button that was supposed to stop the reactor, but instead triggered the explosion. Valery is surprised and realizes that they need to investigate this matter to understand how it happened. On the other hand, Vasily and many of his friends who were hospitalized unfortunately have died. A funeral is held, attended by Lucia, Vasily's wife, and the families of those who died, all feeling very upset. At the same time, many young people heading to a military facility to apply for jobs related to nuclear waste disposal, which of course will likely end with their deaths, just like Vasily and his friends. Now, Valery and Sherbina are sitting with the Minister of Defense to discuss the current situation regarding the hazardous waste from the nuclear reactor. The minister tells them that the youth in the army are contributing to this operation and that everything is going well. But there is a major problem. There is graphite on the roof of the reactor in the plant, which is extremely dangerous and cannot be handled directly by humans, as it could lead to death for anyone nearby in an instant. The solution lies in the need for a robot to be controlled remotely to remove this graphite. The minister reassures them that this will soon be taken care of. After a while, the minister brings in a robot made in West Germany, explaining how it can be controlled remotely. Everyone is encouraged, and they proceed to transport the robot by plane to the reactor site. A soldier begins to control the robot remotely, and Valery, along with the others, watches the operation with excitement. But suddenly, the robot malfunctions without any apparent reason due to its weakness and inability to withstand radiation. At that moment, Sherbina begins to make calls to higher authorities and gets into a fierce argument with them, feeling frustrated with the situation, and he becomes so angry that he breaks the phone. After that, he comes out to Valery and the minister, informing them that unfortunately, the Soviet Union lied to the German scientists who made the robot, telling them about lower radiation levels, which led to the robot being manufactured based on incorrect information, resulting in its malfunction. Morale crashes, and everyone starts thinking about solutions for disposing of the waste. A new idea strikes Valery's mind regarding using humans to remove the graphite waste, taking precautions to ensure their safety. The plan involves a team of workers entering the areas with graphite and working for exactly 90 seconds before quickly exiting to decontaminate, followed by another team. This way, the exposure of the workers to radiation can be minimized. The events continue to escalate as this plan is implemented, creating tension and fear, highlighting the dangers and challenges everyone faces in this crucial national mission. Thus, they will be able to dispose of the graphite waste without harming anyone. They start implementing this plan, and it is indeed successful. A while passes after all this, and we see Anla going to meet Valery and Sherbina, who inform her that soon, Borykanov, Fomin, and Dyatlov are supposed to be put on trial. By the way, Dyatlov has recovered. The important part is that they ask Onla whether she has researched and understood the exact cause of the explosion, as it is supposed that based on Onla, Sherbina, and Valery's statements, these three will be held accountable. Additionally, Valery will soon be attending a conference in Vienna to inform the world about what exactly happened during the explosion. At that moment, Onla shares with them that she was able to determine that the workers, along with Borykanov, Fomin, and Dyatlov, were extremely negligent, which was a key reason the reactor exploded. However, there is also a significant issue with the reactor itself. The button that is supposed to shut down the reactor actually causes it to explode. This is of course a major problem and a primary cause of the reactor explosion and the ensuing disaster. Onla then tells Valery that he must take the opportunity at the Vienna conference to inform the entire world because there are many reactors of the same type that have the same flaw. It's crucial to make people aware so they can be cautious. Naturally, this does not please Sherbina, who informs Valery that if he says that in Vienna, the ruling Communist Party will kill him and his family. Sherbina advises him to think carefully about his decision. Valery is left contemplating, and we are unsure of what he will ultimately decide. On the other side, Lucia has moved to Kiev in hopes of starting a new life. However, one day while she is out in the street, she begins to feel ill because she is going into labor. Naturally, she goes to the hospital. After a while, Lucia has given birth, but unfortunately, her daughter has died because the fetus absorbed radiation from Lucia's body, leading to its demise. Lucia is physically fine and will live without any problems, but she obviously cannot forget this traumatic experience, whether it be the loss of her husband or the death of her daughter. Now, dear, we will go back in time a few hours before the nuclear reactor explosion to see something. At that time, Dyatlov was sitting with Fomin, and they were talking, which reveals that they were planning to conduct a safety test on the fateful day the explosion occurred. With this testimony in front of the court, he would later receive medals and be honored, and so on. At that moment, Valery agreed, as he was compelled to do so. After that, Onla came and met with Valery, pleading with him to tell the truth in court. Perhaps anything could change, and they could decide to repair the rest of the nuclear reactors of the same type before they woke up to another disaster. Valery informed Onla that he would think and see what he would do. Days passed until we reached the awaited day of the trial. During the trial, Sherbina began giving his testimony as the first witness, of course, accusing Dyatlov, Fomin, and Bryukhanov of being responsible for everything that happened and for the explosion of the reactor. After him, Onla entered and also started speaking about the problems caused by the three, Dyatlov, Fomin, and Bryukhanov. Finally, it was Valery's turn to testify. In his testimony, Valery began to explain everything that had happened up until the reactor explosion. He made it clear that just as Dyatlov, Fomin, and Bryukhanov were wrong and negligent, the nuclear reactor also had a manufacturing problem due to cost cutting. This issue was with the safety button, which instead of stopping the reactor, led to its explosion. Valery informed everyone that the Soviet Union had more than 16 reactors of the same type. They must solve these problems as quickly as possible before a new disaster occurs that could end the entire world. And so, the trial concludes. After the trial, the intelligence director takes Valery to an empty room and scolds him, angry about what he has said. The intelligence director informs him that what he has done warrants punishment, potentially even execution. However, he cannot kill him because he appeared at the Vienna conference some time ago, and now the whole world knows him. Therefore, the director tells Valery that he won't kill him, but that his testimony will never be published and no one will ever know about him. He will have to live the rest of his life in the shadows without anyone knowing him or him knowing anyone. Even Sherbina and Onla, his friends, will not be allowed to see or talk to him. He must remain in isolation until he dies. Once the director finishes speaking, his men put Valery into a vehicle to take him to the new place where he will live, away from anyone who knows him. At that moment, Valery sees Onla and Sherbina and bids them farewell with his eyes, knowing it will be the last time he sees them. And thus, dear, this is where the series ends. I would like to inform you that unfortunately, this series is based on a true story, and most of what you have seen actually happened. We find out that Valery lived in complete isolation for 2 years after this trial, until he recorded everything that happened on tapes, as we saw at the beginning, and ultimately committed suicide from loneliness. Of course, those recordings were discovered later, and they provided us with all these details. As for Sherbina, he died in the early 90s due to cancer, which of course he got from radiation exposure. Onla, on the other hand, is not a real character, but in reality, there were many scientists who supported Valery and worked with him. The character of Onla is a tribute to all of them. As for Bryukhanov, Fomin, and Dyatlov, they were sentenced to 10 years in prison, but they eventually got out and continued their lives. However, after some time, Dyatlov died from radiation sickness, while Fomin, ironically, ended up working at a nuclear reactor again. We also know that Lucia lived on and was able to give birth again after her daughter had died. Finally, the city where the Chernobyl reactor explosion occurred remains a forbidden city today due to the radiation present, and it will remain that way for thousands of years or even forever. Ooh, finally, that's it. Bye.